Hey, it's Mazzy, and welcome back. And let's talk about Paul Simon. I've been wanting to do a video on American songwriters since the 1960s, my favorite American songwriters, and Paul Simon is definitely one of them. The other one that I was going to do first, who is my personal favorite, is Randy Newman, and I'll set that up for another time. Obviously, there are songwriters like Carole King and Stevie Wonder and it goes on, and it's hard to just say this is the best songwriter, that's the best band, that's the best. And I have done these ranking videos, and that's not what this is about. At one point I was thinking about doing a profile or doing my collection. Again, since I'm doing these videos as a showcase of my collection, these aren't historic documents by any stretch of the imagination, but I got pushed a little faster into doing this, and not a hard push or a shove, but there is a audiobook that is coming out in the next, imminently, called Miracle and Wonder, and it's a conversation with Paul Simon by the journalist, writer, lecturer Malcolm Gladwell. And if you don't know Malcolm Gladwell, you should. He's a host of a podcast called Revisionist History. He is a contributing editor-writer for The New Yorker. He's written countless books. And it was interesting. I got an email about this podcast, about this audiobook. And what piqued my interest, obviously, was the subject matter, Paul Simon. And I thought this would be a good tie-in. And I got a preview to listen. It's a 4-hour plus audiobook, and I listened to it on and off over a week, and it's done in book formation. And what's really interesting about it, Malcolm had pretty much open access to Paul Simon. I think he did a number of about 9 videos at his place in Hawaii and Connecticut, and he pretty much had open access. Now, Malcolm Gladwell is not your typical music journalist. In fact, he's not a music journalist at all. And he had Bruce Headlam co-interviewed some of these things. There are certain segments of these discussions, and again, I hate to call them interviews because they're not the normal kind of interview program or promotion when Paul Simon or Paul McCartney or Madonna or Billie Eilish, let's keep it contemporary, are promoting a new album or a new project. This is, in a way, a sociological, psychological discussion with Paul. And I think it's really interesting. If you have any interest in Simon & Garfunkel or Paul Simon, which I do immensely, I thought this was really fascinating. Loose discussions, they meander sometimes, they go back and forth. Malcolm put them together in a sort of a chapter order where he discusses the history, songs, in many cases, Paul Simon has an acoustic guitar with him, and we'll go into a rendition of a song or a riff. I'm going to showcase my record collection, and those of you who haven't seen my videos know that I take these videos and I present these videos very personally. I talk about how I got into this music, when I got into the music, what I was going through. So it's not just showcase record. Here's my new Paul Simon record. Here's my old Simon Garfunkel record. That's not what I do on my channel here. And that's not what I'm going to do today. So this isn't a specific overview of Miracle and Wonder, but I'm using that a little bit as a framework to showcase Paul Simon's catalog, discography, and I'm not going to dive deep into every album. I'll talk how I got into it, and we'll take it from there. I just finished 2 nights ago listening to this podcast over about a week's period, and I found it very refreshing that it wasn't like these hard-ass journalistic interviews. There aren't tough questions. It's basically a fanboy in a way. I think Malcolm's a fan of this, so he's not getting too critical, although he does comment, for instance, during the Graceland period, during appropriation, South Africa. There's some of that in there. I'm not going to cover that in detail. You should listen to that podcast, and I will put a link below to that audiobook. And I think it's, if those of you who are into Paul Simon, it's very worthwhile. And it's a different take on the interview process. Malcolm and Paul. Paul loosens up around Malcolm. There's some sort of intimacy, almost like therapeutic, almost like therapy sessions in some ways. I will tell a story, a personal story, that I have shared on my channel before, so I apologize for those of you who have heard me say the story probably twice on different videos, but this video, it probably fits in more importantly, because have you ever wanted to talk to an artist that you've just loved for decades, that you love their music, you love their art form, and you follow them musically and artistically, whether it's, in cinema, music, or anything else? I'll go through his catalog. I first got into Simon and Garfunkel like many people in my generation. I'm kind of that first generation, big Beatle fan, big Dylan's fan, into the Kinks, but the folk scene was important to me. And Simon and Garfunkel with Sounds of Silence, the second version of Sounds of Silence, which became more of a folk rock anthem, if you will, when the original version, unbeknownst to Simon and Garfunkel, the producer added a drum track, electric guitar track, and made it sort of a jangly Bob Dylan folk rock, Byrds style folk rock album at Columbia Records, and it became a huge hit. Thus, Simon and Garfunkel got together. In terms of the catalog, I'm going to start here. Now, I didn't get this until well into the 1970s. This, for many years, was only available as an import. When I worked in record stores, I got it. And this is the Paul Simon songbook. I believe this was recorded in 1965 in England. After Simon Garfunkel's first album, it kind of split up. Art Garfunkel went to Columbia University. Paul went to find his musical spirituality, I guess you could say, in the UK. Befriended musicians, befriended Kathy. I believe this is Kathy. And wrote a song for her and all these songs. Some of these songs would appear later as Simon and Garfunkel versions. This album didn't do very well either at the time, as like their first album. But this album is a beautiful acoustic folk album of those songs that we all, of course, now know. And by the time I got this record, I had known these songs backwards and forwards from the versions by Simon and Garfunkel. Again, it came out 1965 in the UK. It really didn't do much, but because of the new version of Sounds of Silence, with the folk rock version becoming a huge hit, Simon and Garfunkel reformed, got back in the studio, and the rest is history. I did pick up all their albums, starting with that album, went back and got the first album after Sounds of Silence, but the album for me, and I'm just going to show this right off the bat, the only real Simon and Garfunkel record I'm going to showcase in this particular video is Bookends. Bookends is my favorite album, 1968. To me, this is a perfect pop album. I like this album better than Bridge Over Troubled Waters. Bridge Over Troubled Waters obviously is the biggest hit, one of the biggest selling albums of all time. At the time, I think it was the biggest selling album of all time until, Michael Jackson's Thriller. So Columbia did well with their big sales, but this album is a perfect pop masterpiece. A little bit of psychedelia thrown in, imaginative arrangements, and I just love this record. And recently, those of you who've been following my channel, I acquired a record collection of my late friend Coleman, who passed away, and these records from the Coleman collection. This has been a grail that I've been looking for so long, and Coleman and I would talk about this record. This is a mono version of Simon & Garfunkel's Bookends, which is really rare. 2i, Columbia, and the rumor I've heard is that Paul Simon doesn't like the mono version. That's why it's never come out. With all this vinyl resurgence and reissues, and for some reason, Bookends has never come out in mono. A little crispy, this copy, but it does have a different sound, and it bursts out of the speakers. I still prefer the stereo. I'm more of a stereo guy, even with Sgt. Pepper. Everybody says the mono, the Beatles like the mono. That's the way they intended. What are you going to do? I like the stereo. But I just wanted to showcase this. So, Paul Simon does this album. Now, What's interesting about Miracle and Wonder, he goes sort of in sequential order, in historical order, and has chapters like The Mystery, The Gift of Queens. There are chapters within this audiobook from artists like Jeff Tweedy, talking about a specific song, the opera singer Renee Fleming, Sting, a few other people that intertwine, Quincy Jones. But it's really the discussions with Paul Simon that are my favorite, where he talks about, what he was getting into, in songwriting, and about his song styling with and vocalizing with Art Garfunkel, how they came together. I'm not going to again tell the history. Listen to that and read any book on Simon and Garfunkel. But this is his first solo album. I believe this came out in 1972. This is amongst my favorite. Now, perfect pop pieces. A big thing of Paul Simon's career was his collaborations, and it goes back to El Condor Pasa, as far as I remember, which was on Bridge Over Troubled Waters, and he uses Urubamba. Urubamba is a Peruvian, South American musical instrumental outfit that does beautiful panpipes and guitars and percussive. This is an album that Columbia put out that Paul Simon produced in 1974. I remember getting this album when it came out. During my record purge, I got rid of it and I found another copy with a hype sticker still, talking about how they were the group that recorded El Condor Pasa and how it became this sort of fusion. Now, that's something that's an important part of Paul Simon's career, especially his solo career, where he fused his art, his songwriting, with different musicalities from different places, from New Orleans, from the South, from South America, obviously from Africa, and bringing in these different musical formats. Now, we could talk about for days the concept of artist appropriation and taking, music from different cultures and making it yours. And I'm one who feels usually these artists turn us on to music that we may never have heard. Particularly for me, it was 1966 and then 65 actually, with the Beatles doing Norwegian Wood and George Harrison playing the sitar on that, the Indian instrument. And of course in 1967, Within You Without You, with Indian classical musicians. And I got into Ravi Shankar. I got into classical music because of George Harrison. And a lot of these other artists like Paul Simon got me into these other cultures. I bought this album. He put this album out. It brought it to a wider audience. So I think that's a really great thing. On here, you got the Dixing Hummingbirds. You got these beautiful vocalists singing the song Tenderness, which is a great song here. You got Love Me Like a Rock, Take Me to the Mardi Gras, Kodachrome, American Tune, which some people believe one of his greatest American songs. So love this record. This came out in 1973 and was pretty much a huge hit, Kodachrome right out the gate. But I think that's a great opening song, but there are much better songs on here. So love this record. I love that he acknowledges the other musicians and he talks about that. So there you go. Just in passing, live Ryman Simon. And this is a beautiful record too. Still crazy after all these years. What's interesting about this record, I like this record, but I get a little tired of this record for my personal taste. It's a beautiful record. I think it's electric piano on this that just for some reason just get a little stale for me personally, musically. I like his guitar-paced music aside, obviously, except for Bridge Over Troubled Waters, that great, great gospel thing. Going back to that, think of that. Bridge Over Troubled Waters came out in 1970. I did a video early on, or at least in the last year, on the gospel according to rock and roll. 1970 was the year that I got into gospel because of these white artists doing gospel. Think about it. End of 69 into 70, Laney and Bonnie, very blue-eyed soul, had a real strong gospel side. Leon Russell had a gospel side. Joe Cocker, All Things Must Pass with My Sweet Lord. The piano playing of Billy Preston on God, John Lennon from his 1970 Plastic Ono Band album. And of course, Bridge Over Troubled Waters. It's such a great piano piece on that, and it had to be in the piano. But this, I like this, but I'll never forget, and maybe it's something that is because of a generational thing and growing up with this record in 1975. 1975 was the year, I believe, Saturday Night Live started. And I'll never forget him coming on stage, playing Still Crazy after all these years, wearing a chicken suit. And it kind of scarred me for life for that song, although I think it's a wonderful song. 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, Have a Good Time. I do love this record. My Little Town, which was nice about that, it was sort of a return with Simon, with Art Garfunkel. It was a one-off. That album was on this record, and it was also placed on, I think, Breakaway, the solo album by Art Garfunkel. You know, I'm sure the deal was you weren't going to put it on just a Paul Simon record to get the sales, so I think it helped Art Garfunkel as well on that record. In this audiobook, Paul Simon talks about songwriting, talks about how he records these records, talks about the perfectionist side of him working on these things, looking for new sounds. And a big part of the presentation, and a big part what you take away from this piece, and what I've always thought about Paul Simon is, especially in the second, the final, or the last 10, 15, even 20 years of his career, he does what he wants. He doesn't follow what's popular. He moves ahead. I mean, Paul McCartney does that to a point, but to me, Paul McCartney still tries to chase the hit a little bit. I think he's more conscious of that, where Paul Simon, you know, if the hit comes, I'd obviously, when he made Graceland, I don't think that was something that he even really considered to do as a hit record, of all the shit he went through doing that record. Briefly, I'll show One Trick Pony. To me, one of somewhat of a failure. Of course, it has Late in the Evening, which is kind of a fun song. There's some good music on here, but unfortunately it was tied in with one of those, I'd say his version of like Paul McCartney doing a movie, Give My Regards to Broad Street. Total trashy. This is terrible, the movie. Same with McCartney's Give My Regards to Broad Street. I only do that because they're sort of artistic vanity projects, and forgot what year this came out. I mean, before that, I think the only thing I saw Paul Simon do in acting, was it before it or after, was the cameo he has in Annie Hall, Woody Allen's Annie Hall. Pretty funny. Anyway, not a fan of this. Now, Hearts and Bones, Paul Simon's Hearts and Bones. He's on Warner Brothers here. This came out in 1983. Now, I love this album. There's a certain mood to this album. It's not one of his more popular albums. Allergies, Hearts and Bones, Think Too Much, Renee and Georgia Magritte with their dog after the war is one of the best songs on the album. And the late, great Johnny Ace, about the blues rock R&B singer who was shot down. But this is really a song about John Lennon being shot down. And he mentions John Lennon, you know, the late great Johnny Ace, and he refers to John Lennon being in New York when he heard the news when that happened. And it has a beautiful, beautiful ending by Philip Glass, a repetitive, hypnotic ending that ends the album out. And to me, it's probably one of the most beautiful endings of any record I own. I just love that. And especially at the time in 1983, just, you know, basically 3 years, 2.5 years after John Lennon's assassination, the way that closes out this album, to me, is just really gorgeous. Love this. So 1986 comes along. He talks about this in the on the audiobook, about getting a mixtape of African music and pursuing it. On my channel, I've showcased records I've gotten from a label out of Germany called Analog Africa. And they put out these amazing comps and unissued work that has never been in the States and in Europe. It's a German label, but beautiful comps of African music, some South American music, but everything from funky, psychedelic, Afro, funk, and soul, and these great comps. African Screen Contest is one that you should check out, but go to their Bandcamp page, Analog Africa, and check them out. Their records are beautiful. I could just imagine some of that music being on these tapes in some ways, maybe possibly this mixtape that Paul Simon got. And he pursues it. He talks about that in the audiobook with Malcolm, about that, about hearing that, and through various other artists seeking out musicians to play with, and goes to South Africa. Now, that was a controversial. This is during apartheid, and in a way, it helps open it. But he got a lot of flack from musicians. It talks in the podcast about Billy Bragg and I think Paul Weller, as many others. Remember, there was a whole anti-apartheid thing. Little Steven from this E Street Band put out this anti-apartheid album, and it was big in the news. But over the next few years, apartheid finally broke. Nelson Mandela becomes the president of South Africa, and actually Nelson Mandela invites Paul Simon and this African band to play, and that he got a lot of flack. The artist got a lot of flack and got in terms of some violent outbursts and things that happened. Again, listen to the audio book, but this comes out of this. I was thinking about this record. Love this record. I may be a little more partial to the one after this, Rhythm of the Saints, but you can't argue that this is a masterpiece. This, without, not without controversy, but ultimately a beautiful song. And ironically, the music, for the most part, is not about Africa. He talks about in the, with Malcolm, singing the lyrics almost like placeholders of Graceland, Memphis, Tennessee. It's not with his African music and African band backing him up. I mean, he still plays to this day with the bass player that's on this from South Africa, is in his touring band. But The Boy in the Bubble, to me, is my favorite song on here. I can remember that MTV video with this sort of animation and cut and paste. Just a gorgeous song. Beautiful song. Graceland, of course. Diamonds on the soles of her shoes. I think the weak link again for me, and again, Saturday Night ruins Paul Simon for me. I know he's a friend of Lorne Michaels and all that, and I'm just going to say it, Paul. I'm sure you're not watching this, but whoever's watching this, you can call me Al. Kind of novelty-ish. Chevy Chase in that video. Okay, again, fucking Chevy Chase in that video. You can call me Al. Under African Skies. There's a great, vocal harmony on this by Linda Ronstadt too. And it's not without controversy. I've read articles, and again, I'm not going to just say everything is so great in the world of Paul Simon and his records, and you hear stories on either side. Los Lobos feel like they got fucked, working on this record. So I just like the record. I want to take the bullshit out of this stuff. This is an amazing record, and I think should be in everybody's record collection. Paul Simon's Graceland. This is interesting. This is one of my favorite albums of Paul Simon's career, Rhythm of the Saints. It's a very percussive record. It's South American. I think in most cases, on most of the songs, maybe all the songs, the percussion was laid down first. The rhythms were laid down first, and Paul Simon kind of writes around it, weaves in and out of it. Beautiful record. This cover really just tells you all you need to know about what's going to be on this record. Didn't do as well as Graceland, but it's a gorgeous record. Love this to pieces. Again, it's hard to follow up. How do you follow up Graceland? How do you follow up like Paul McCartney, Band on the Run? How do you Pink Floyd follow up Dark Side of the Moon? Talking about these sort of the boomer bands, and when you have such a hit that is such a massive hit, how does Michael Jackson follow up Thriller? You do or you don't, There is a segment which is kind of nice. Roy Halley, there's a segment on the audiobook about Roy Halley, who was pretty much almost the entire career the engineer that worked with Simon and Garfunkel and worked with Paul Simon on most of his albums, maybe all of his albums. And he talks about certain songs. He actually does a great story that I had read before about working on one of my favorite songs on Bridge Over Troubled Waters is The Only Living Boy in New York. And that harmony thing where he actually put them, Simon and Garfunkel, in the echo booth, in the chamber at Columbia Studios. Usually you do these echo things and you don't have singers literally shoved in that. But I think I saw a documentary about that too, where they talk about that. And I think it's amazing hearing that discussion by Roy Halley on talking with Malcolm Gladwell about that record. In 1972, from 1970 to 1973, I had a girlfriend named Judy. I met her in 1970 when I went with my confirmation class to Israel. She was a year older than me. I was 16, she was 17. So in 1972, that summer, end of August, I turned 18. She was 19 years old, year and a half older than me. That summer, I actually volunteered for the George McGovern campaign. That was the year the 18-year-olds got to vote. That fall, I registered to vote. I was a George McGovern fan. This was against Richard Nixon, obviously, before Watergate and all that. I worked for George McGovern. So one night, Judy and I, in end of August 1970, went to see a movie on Geary Boulevard in the outer Richmond district of San Francisco called Lovers and Other Strangers. Kind of a light movie, very much like a Neil Simon play, Neil Simon movie. Nothing really memorable. We went to see the movie. I had a 1972 Ford Pinto, brown, with white and brown two-tone interior seats, 2 doors. Pintos, that's another story. I was parked right across the street from the theater in front of Joe's Ice Cream Shop, this great kind of neighborhood ice cream store where I think they made their own ice cream. I get in my car, and on either side, the little wing windows, the back seat, I had George McGovern, 1972, McGovern Shriver bumper stickers. I'm in the car. I open the door. Judy gets in. I'm sitting in the car. I roll down my window and look out. Right on the corner on Geary at 18th, right across this short street, I saw Art Garfunkel standing there. And I said, Judy, that's Art Garfunkel's over there. And of course, think about this. Simon and Garfunkel was my favorite duo. I mean, I'm too young to really embrace at the time the Everly Brothers. And by the time that I was growing up, they were, old school in a way, although I love the Everly Brothers. Art Garfunkel was one of the biggest acts in the world, from 1970, 69, 68, 69, 70, 71. They were the folk rock duo. And obviously Bridge Over Troubled Water had won Grammys and was the album of the year in 1970. So this is just 2 years later. I see Art Garfunkel there. And I looked at him and I'm like grabbing Judy's hand. Because this is 1972. I'm 18 years old. I'm a huge music fan. I was buying a shitload of records then. And Art Garfunkel, we connect eyes. He's looking at my eyes. And literally, I don't know how long it was, maybe only a minute, he starts walking towards me, walking towards the car. He leans down. I roll up down my window. He leans down and he looks at the back and he says, "Why are you for George McGovern?" Now, set the stage. This was like maybe a month or two after Simon and Garfunkel get together for a brief reunion to do a benefit for George McGovern in New York. And I knew about that because I was working on the McGovern campaign. Obviously, just a volunteer, nothing special. And I said, I was tongue-tied. I said, need a ride anywhere? And he goes, sure. He gets in the car. Well, obviously, Judy kind of sits forward. You have to push the car back. He's sitting behind in this little tight 2-door Ford Pinto. And we start going down Geary Boulevard towards downtown. And I said, what are you doing in San Francisco? He says he's recording his first solo album. at Columbia Studios, which was on Folsom Street on South of Market at the time. We're driving down, and I said, "Where are you going?" He goes, "Well, I'm looking for some good Chinese food, good Chinese restaurants." And I knew right away. My parents used to take me to a place in Chinatown at the time called Nam Yen, and I said, "Yeah, there's a place called Nam Yen downtown or in Chinatown, right off of Kearny." So we drive downtown, we park, and we go in this restaurant. I'm with Judy, beautiful Judy. I'm in love with Judy. 18 years old, sitting in a booth with Art Garfunkel. Art Garfunkel and I think Judy was in the middle and I was across, and we were like in eye contact. And of course, Judy's beautiful. Art Garfunkel starts asking us questions. Are you two in love? Turns out, I find out later, like a few months later, he gets married. So I don't know what was going through his mind, but he was asking these personal questions. And I was talking about music, what I was into. We talked about Beatles records and what he loved about the Beatles. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this story up, because he told me something that I hadn't heard. I didn't know at the time. Now, obviously, now it's common knowledge with biographies. And it came up in this audiobook when Malcolm was speaking with Paul about him and Art Garfunkel, early on. Art Garfunkel said they were about perfection. They would sit like literally this close from each other, mouth to mouth, looking to see where their tongues were, where the placement of their tongues during every note, when they, sang a note, when they listen to the interview. Paul talks about it a little bit, and it was like the shock of the new old, going back almost 50 years now, 50 years next year, of meeting Art Garfunkel. We spent the evening talking. We were in a booth. We probably spent 2 hours in that restaurant, and there's a lot of other things that come back to me every once in a while. After that, I said, "Do you need a ride anywhere?" He goes, "Yeah, can you take me to Union Street?" Because he ended up going to Union Street to the Metro Theater to go see the midnight show of The Candidate. Great fucking movie with Robert Redford. Very political film. Very topical then as is now. Wonderful film if you like movies about politics. And it was filmed in the Bay Area. So I dropped him off, and that was it. And the album that he was recording at the time was this album. Obviously, when it came out, I fell in love with it. I've showed this on my channel many times. To me, this is a guilty pleasure, but it shouldn't be a guilty. It's one of the most gorgeous, beautiful, angelic recordings I have in my collection. Some of it recorded again at Columbia Studios, some of it at Grace Cathedral up on Nob Hill. Jerry Garcia plays guitar. There's choirs, boy choirs. Beautiful, beautiful Jimmy Webb songs, and it became, much of a hit. So I want to insert that here because this is part of the story, and it really showcases what I latched onto in this audiobook was hanging out with someone and not being in awe. After a while, we were talking about personal things, about the movies he was in, Catch-22, and he was doing this movie career, and we didn't get into the the nitty gritty of, the bullshit of arguing of Paul's and Artie's tempestuous relationship. It was about music. It was about art. It was about love. And I'm like this 18-year-old, literally kid, young man with Judy, someone I was in love with at that young age. Really going through, there's a whole section on this. This is a Songs of the Cape Man, one of Paul Simon's artistic big failures. It was a Broadway production. Interesting record. There's some great stuff on here, but listen to that. You can know about that. Only had on CDs. You're the One. I like this record. I think this is a lovely record. Obviously, I like Hurricane Eye a lot too on this record. I'm not as in deep with this record as I am a lot of records, but this record to me is brilliant. Now, they talk about Paul Simon's career. He's artistically, he's been amazing. He does what he wants to do. He experiments. It's not about, following or trying to get the hit record anymore. He does what he does. And unfortunately, a lot of people haven't followed along. And I would argue that some of these later records maybe aren't as easy, catchy, song-based like he used to write, but they're records that are very rewarding if you take the time and jump in and listen to them multi-listens. And to me, those are amongst my favorite records. But this record was sort of co-produced, I don't know if it's actually production, but with Sound Landscapes. They're called like Sonic Sound Landscapes by Brian Eno. So it's produced by Paul Simon, but it's got some of those, Eno twerking soundscapes that really supplement. And I love that an artist like Paul Simon will dive in and try something really different. It's a gorgeous record. I do not have it on vinyl. I hope it comes out on vinyl at some point again. I think it was briefly, but I think these records, these later records, all deserve to come out in some kind of a vinyl form because they just sound really, really great. So love this record. Then what I think to be is a later masterpiece is So Beautiful, So What. It opens up with a Christmas song, but it's a funky Christmas song with sampling of this preacher, and it's called Getting Ready for Christmas Day. And it's got this great percussive sound and this like preacher just chanting away, doing his bit, and a fantastic record. There's some great songs on here. There's Rewrite, The Afterlife, Amulet, Love and Blessings, So Beautiful, So What. I would argue this is possibly it's definitely a top 5 record in the Paul Simon catalog for me. And I'm fortunate enough to have a vinyl version of this. I love this record to pieces. Paul Simon, So Beautiful, So What. This is another record that creeped in that doesn't get a lot of love, but should. And this is Stranger to Stranger. This came out on Concord Records. This is 2015, I believe, or 2016. Again, another wonderful record. Has the werewolf wristband. It's a fun story about, having your wristband to get into the club or backstage or the VIP thing. And really, really a well-organized and fun record. More song-based than maybe the two prior to this in a way, but it's got a great feel to this as well. So again, it says produced by Paul Simon and his old partner, Roy Halley. Fantastic record. This is the latest record he's put out, and this is In the Blue Light, and it's reworkings. There's a whole thing of certain artists that like to take and rework their material. I think it's an artistic, not being an artist myself, I can't imagine once you have this perfect song, that's it. Putting out A Day in the Life. If John Lennon or Paul McCartney took Day in the Life or Here, There, and Everywhere and redid it now, and I know Paul's done that occasionally, to make it different. I mean, how can you, when you know something for 50 plus years, how can you rework it? Now, some of these songs aren't the biggest songs. Pigs, Sheep, and Wolves, Renee and Georgia Magritte, The Teacher, Southern, One Man's Ceiling is Another Man's Floor, Darling, Lorraine. So he didn't take Sounds of Silence. He didn't take Kodachrome. He didn't take You Can Call Me Al. He took these songs in a way, some may say they were the forgotten songs, and maybe that's why he wanted to bring them out again to do it. It's a beautiful cover. It's a lovely record. It's more of a challenging record with the arrangements, and I think if you invest in this work, it's really a wonderful project. Now, that's pretty much my take on the Paul Simon solo catalog and Miracle and Wonder, this audiobook, curated, interviewed, and edited together by Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm does some discussion overlapping, introducing the chapters. Sometimes in the middle of a segment, he'll talk about where they are, how they got to be where this discussion is at the moment. And it's really interesting and it's really rewarding. So love this catalog. One of the great American songwriters of the last 60 years, definitely. I'll get to Randy Newman, definitely. Because, I mean, obviously, two Jewish writers writing completely different types of things. Randy's got that snarky, historical, political background of things. Paul Simon doesn't seem to be a funny guy per se. He didn't strike me as someone funny, and I think if I was in that room, I would want to kind of get into there. I mean, as serious as I can be, those of you who watch me know I have a little snark side. So I think I almost would rather hang out with Randy Newman and talk to Randy Newman in this kind of format. Yet Randy Newman could be very dry and almost act like he's bored. Like, what the fuck is this, Maslow? Or in that kind of case. So anyway, I appreciate watching. Links below to everything. And tell me your comments, what you like about Paul Simon, Simon & Garfunkel, Art Garfunkel, any of this. And we'll see you next time. Mazzy loves you.